The fluorescent lights above me buzzed like angry wasps as I stood in line at the Riverside Community Food Bank, clutching a wrinkled paper bag and trying to make myself invisible. At 73 years old, I never imagined I'd be here, surrounded by families with hollow eyes and children tugging at worn sleeves, all of us waiting for donated groceries to stretch another week. But what stung more than the shame burning in my chest wasn't that I needed help. It was that my own daughter-in-law, Amanda, had dropped me off here like discarded furniture and driven away without a backward glance. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. She didn't know that the building we stood in, the volunteers sorting cans behind the counter, the refrigerated trucks that delivered fresh produce every Tuesday, all of it existed because of monthly checks I'd been writing for the past 15 years. Amanda thought she was teaching me a lesson about being a burden. She had no idea she'd just abandoned the woman who made this place possible. The morning had started like any other Tuesday in my small apartment above Martinez Bakery, the business my late husband Roberto and I had built from nothing 47 years ago. I woke to the familiar scent of fresh bread rising in the ovens. Below, a smell that had become as much a part of me as my own heartbeat. The bakers started work at 4 a.m, and by 7, the aroma would drift through the old building's wooden floors, wrapping around me like a warm embrace from Roberto himself. I was Nancy Martinez, though most people in our neighborhood simply called me Señora Nancy. I'd lived in the same 3-room apartment for decades, refusing Roberto's suggestions to move somewhere bigger even after the bakery became successful. This place held our memories, the corner where we'd danced to mariachi music on our wedding anniversary, the kitchen table where we'd planned every expansion of the business, the bedroom window that overlooked the street where Roberto had first kissed me 52 years ago. Our son Miguel had been born in the back room of the original bakery, and I'd raised him between flour sacks and mixing bowls, teaching him to knead dough before he could properly hold a pencil. He grew up understanding that hard work wasn't just about earning money. It was about feeding people, creating something that mattered, building a legacy that would outlast us all. Miguel had inherited Roberto's gentle nature and my stubborn determination. He became a successful architect, designing affordable housing projects across the state, and when he married Amanda 5 years ago, I thought I was gaining a daughter. Amanda was beautiful, educated, and came from a wealthy family in the suburbs. She had silky blonde hair that never seemed out of place, manicured nails that clicked against her phone screen, and a wardrobe that cost more than some families made. In a year, at first I tried to welcome her with open arms. I taught her Roberto's secret recipe for tres leches cake, showed her how to fold empanadas so the edges sealed perfectly, and shared stories about Miguel's childhood that made her laugh until tears streamed down her carefully applied makeup. But gradually, I began to notice the way her smile never quite reached her eyes when she looked at me, how she'd change the subject whenever Miguel mentioned his father or our family traditions. The apartment that had once felt cozy began to feel cramped when Amanda visited. She'd wrinkle her nose at the smell of garlic and cumin that clung to my clothes, suggest that Miguel and I meet at restaurants instead of my kitchen, and make subtle comments about how I was getting older and might be happier in a senior living community. She never said it directly, but the message was clear. I was an inconvenience, a reminder of a life she thought Miguel should leave behind. After Roberto died 3 years ago, the distance became even more pronounced. Amanda seemed to view my grief as a performance, my memories as manipulation. When I'd tell stories about Roberto at family dinners, she'd check her phone or steer the conversation toward their vacation plans or the new car she wanted Miguel to buy. She treated my past like it was something embarrassing, something that reflected poorly on the sophisticated life she was trying to build with my son. Miguel, caught between loyalty to his mother and love for his wife, began visiting less frequently. Our weekly dinners became monthly phone calls, our holiday traditions became suggestions he'd consider if Amanda didn't have other plans. I watched, My son slip away slowly, pulled into a world where I didn't fit, where my Spanish accent was too thick, my clothes too old-fashioned, my apartment too small and too filled with memories of a man Amanda had barely known. But I endured it all because Miguel was my heart walking around outside my body, and I would have done anything to preserve his happiness, even if it meant swallowing my pride, accepting the role of the inconvenient mother-in-law, and pretending not to notice how Amanda's eyes would glaze over whenever I spoke. The bakery continued to thrive under the management team Roberto and I had carefully trained, but I spent most of my days alone now, reading novels in Spanish and English, tending to the small herb garden on my fire escape, and maintaining the charitable work Roberto and I had quietly supported for years. We'd never been flashy with our success. We lived simply, saved carefully, and gave generously to causes that mattered to us. The Riverside Community Food Bank had been one of our primary recipients since it opened 15 years ago. We'd watched the neighborhood change, seen families struggle as jobs disappeared and rent prices soared, and Roberto had insisted that our success meant nothing if we couldn't help our community eat. Every month, I wrote a check for $5,000 to keep the food bank operational, funding everything from rent to refrigeration to the salaries of the 3 full-time staff members who kept the place running. I'd never told Miguel about the extent of our charitable giving. Roberto and I had agreed early on that true generosity happened in silence, without expectation of recognition or gratitude. The food bank's director, Mrs. Chen, knew me only as a reliable donor who preferred to remain anonymous. The monthly checks came from a trust Roberto had established, signed by our lawyer, with no direct connection to the Martinez name. Amanda knew none of this. To her, I was simply an aging woman who lived above a bakery, someone whose financial situation she'd never bothered to understand, because she'd never bothered to understand me at all. The morning everything changed started with a phone call that came too early and felt too urgent. Amanda's voice was sharp when I answered, cutting through the peaceful quiet of my morning coffee ritual. "Nancy, we need to talk. Miguel's at work, but I'm coming over. We can't keep pretending everything is fine." I set down my cup, the café con leche suddenly bitter on my tongue. "Is everything all right? Is Miguel?" "Miguel is fine. It's you we need to discuss." The line went dead, leaving me staring at the phone and feeling a familiar dread settle in my stomach. Amanda had never called me Nancy before. It had always been Mrs. Martinez, delivered with the kind of polite distance that made it clear she'd never consider calling me Mom or Mommy, like I'd hoped she might someday. 20 minutes later, she stood in my living room wearing a cream-colored suit that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget, her expression somewhere between pity and impatience. She didn't sit down when I offered, didn't accept the coffee I'd prepared, just stood near the door like she was afraid something in my apartment might contaminate her perfectly pressed outfit. "I've been talking to Miguel about your situation," she began, her voice taking on the tone she might use with a difficult client. "We're concerned about you living alone at your age, especially in this neighborhood. Crime rates are going up, and you're becoming isolated." I felt my back straighten. "I've lived in this neighborhood for 47 years, Amanda. I know every family on this block, every shop owner, That's exactly the problem." She cut me off with a wave of her manicured hand. "You're stuck in the past, Nancy. Miguel and I have been discussing options for your future, and we think it's time to consider a change." The word options hit me like cold water. In my experience, when someone used that word, they weren't really offering choices. They were delivering decisions that had already been made. Amanda pulled out her phone and scrolled through what looked like screenshots. "I've researched several excellent senior living communities. They offer meal plans, social activities, transportation services. You wouldn't have to worry about cooking, or cleaning or maintaining this place anymore." I stared at her, trying to process what I was hearing. "Amanda, I'm 73, not 93. I run a successful business. I cook because I enjoy it, not because I have to. I don't need..." You're living above a commercial kitchen, Nancy. The noise, the smells, the health department regulations. It can't be comfortable anymore. Her voice carried that particular brand of condescension that made my teeth clench. And honestly, Miguel worries about you constantly. Every time there's a break-in in the area or a news story about elderly people being targeted, he can't sleep. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Miguel worried about me. The phrase stung because I knew it was probably true, but not for the reasons Amanda was suggesting. Miguel worried because his wife had convinced him that loving his mother and honoring his heritage made him less sophisticated, less modern, less worthy of the life she'd planned for them. I appreciate your concern, I said carefully, but I'm not ready to leave my home. The bakery needs me, and the bakery has a management team. They barely need you to sign checks anymore. Amanda's patience was clearly wearing thin. You're holding on to something that doesn't need you, Nancy. Miguel has moved on. He has a career, a wife, plans for the future that don't involve living in the past. The words hung in the air like smoke from a grease fire, acrid and impossible to ignore. She was telling me, in the kindest possible way, that I was no longer necessary in my son's life. That the business Roberto and I had built, the neighborhood where we'd raised our family, the traditions that connected us to our roots, all of it was just an embarrassing anachronism that Miguel needed to outgrow. I need time to think about this, I said finally. Amanda's smile was thin and sharp. Of course. But Nancy, I hope you'll consider what's best for everyone. Miguel's been offered a promotion that might require relocating, and it would be so much easier if he didn't have to worry about you being alone here. After she left, I sat in my kitchen for a long time, staring at the wall where Roberto and I had hung photographs from every stage of our life together. Our wedding day, Miguel's first communion, the grand opening of the bakery's second location, family celebrations that stretched back decades. In every picture, we looked like people who belonged to each other, who had built something lasting and meaningful. But Amanda was right about one thing. Miguel had moved on. The boy who'd helped me roll masa every Saturday morning had become a man who spent his weekends touring model homes in gated communities, planning a future that looked nothing like the life we'd given him. I called Miguel that evening, hoping to have a real conversation about Amanda's visit, but he was distracted, rushed, clearly uncomfortable with the topic. Mom, Amanda mentioned she talked to you today. I want you to know this isn't about us, not wanting you around. It's about making sure you're safe and happy. I am safe and happy, mijo. But for how long? What happens if you get sick? What happens if something goes wrong with the building? You're too proud to ask for help, and that scares me. I wanted to tell him that pride wasn't the problem. It was his wife's inability to see me as anything more than an obligation. I wanted to explain that staying in our neighborhood wasn't about clinging to the past, but about honoring the future Roberto and I had envisioned when we chose to build our life here. I wanted to ask why the woman I'd raised to value family and community was now being told those things made him backward. But I could hear Amanda's voice in the background, calling him to dinner, and I knew this wasn't a conversation I could win over the phone. Think about what Amanda showed you, Miguel said gently. Some of those places look really nice. You could make new friends, try new things. After we hung up, I walked through the apartment touching things that held memories. Roberto's reading chair, the dining table where we'd hosted every holiday for 30 years, the kitchen where I'd taught Miguel to cook the foods of our heritage. Everything felt fragile suddenly, like it might disappear if I stopped paying attention. That night, I called Mrs. Chen at the food bank. It was late, but I knew she often worked evenings, sorting donations and preparing for the next day's distribution. Her voice was warm when she answered, the kind of warmth that came from someone who spent her days helping people. Mrs. Chen, it's Nancy. I wanted to ask about your volunteer program. Do you ever need help during distribution days? Oh, Nancy, that's so generous of you to offer. We always need volunteers, especially people who speak Spanish. But are you sure? It can be physically demanding, and we start early. I assured her I was certain, and we arranged for me to start the following Tuesday. I didn't tell her that I needed to see the food bank from the inside, to understand what my monthly checks had built, to feel connected to something meaningful at a time when everything else in my life felt uncertain. What I didn't expect was that Amanda would somehow learn about my volunteer work and decide it was proof that I was losing my independence, making poor decisions, putting myself in dangerous situations. What I couldn't have predicted was that she would see my desire to help others as confirmation that I needed help myself. The Tuesday morning that changed everything started with a phone call from Amanda at 6 a.m. Nancy, Miguel, told me you're volunteering at some food bank downtown. I'm coming to pick you up. Amanda, I don't need... Yes, you do. If you're going to insist on doing this kind of work, at least let me drive you. Miguel would never forgive me if something happened to you on public transportation. I should have refused. I should have insisted on taking the bus like I'd planned. Should have maintained the independence that Amanda was so determined to strip away from me. But I was tired of fighting, tired of being seen as difficult every time I asserted my own preferences. So I agreed, thinking that maybe if Amanda saw the food bank, saw the good work being done there, she'd understand why it mattered to me. I was waiting on the sidewalk when her silver BMW pulled up, its paint job so perfect it looked like liquid metal in the morning sunlight. Amanda was wearing yoga clothes and oversized sunglasses, her hair pulled back in a ponytail that probably took her 20 minutes to make look effortless. "Good morning," I said, settling into the passenger seat that felt more expensive than my entire living room set. "Morning." Amanda's greeting was clipped, distracted. She was already pulling away from the curb, navigating through traffic with the kind of aggressive efficiency that made me grip the door handle. "Miguel thinks this volunteer thing is a phase, but I'm worried you're not thinking clearly about the kind of people you'll be around." I turned to look at her profile, trying to understand what she meant. "What kind of people?" "Nancy, food banks serve homeless people, drug addicts, families that can't manage their finances. It's not safe for someone your age to be around that kind of desperation." The casual cruelty of her words took my breath away. These weren't kinds of people to me. They were neighbors, families facing impossible choices, workers whose wages couldn't keep up with rising costs. They were people like the family who lived above the hardware store, where the father had been laid off 6 months ago and the mother was working 2 part-time jobs without benefits. They were people like Mrs. Rodriguez, whose Social Security check had to cover both rent and her diabetes medication, leaving nothing for groceries some weeks. Amanda, people use food banks because they need help, not because they're dangerous. She sighed, the sound carrying that familiar note of exasperation. "You're being naive, Nancy? These places attract crime, drug dealing, all sorts of problems. Miguel doesn't want you putting yourself at risk just because you're bored." We drove the rest of the way in silence, Amanda's judgment hanging in the air like exhaust fumes. When we pulled up to the food bank, I could see volunteers already setting up tables outside, arranging boxes of produce and canned goods with the kind of careful organization that spoke to practiced efficiency. "I'll pick you up at noon," Amanda said, not looking at the building or the people beginning to gather. "Try not to give out any personal information or bring anything valuable." I wanted to tell her that the only valuable thing I was bringing was my time, my willingness to help, my belief that community meant taking care of each other. Instead, I just nodded and got out of the car, watching her drive away without a backward glance. Mrs. Chen greeted me at the entrance with a warm smile and a clipboard full of instructions. She was a small woman in her 50s with graying hair, pulled back in a practical bun and eyes that seemed to see everything at once. She'd been running the food bank for 8 years, ever since her husband lost his job, and they'd found themselves needing help for the first time. Nancy, I'm so glad you could make it. Let me show you around and introduce you to our regular volunteers. The building was larger than it appeared from outside, with industrial shelving lining the walls and several large coolers humming quietly in the back. Everything was meticulously organized. Canned goods sorted by type, fresh produce arranged by ripeness, household items like soap and toilet paper stacked neatly near the entrance. We serve about 200 families a week, Mrs. Chen explained as we walked through the space. Tuesday and Friday are our main distribution days, but we're here every day accepting donations and preparing packages for families that can't make it during regular hours. She introduced me to the other volunteers: retired teachers, stay-at-home, parents, college students fulfilling community service requirements, and several people who had once been clients themselves and now gave back when they could. Everyone seemed to know each other, working together with the kind of easy coordination that came from shared purpose. Nancy, you mentioned you speak Spanish fluently. Would you mind helping with intake? We have several families who are more comfortable discussing their needs in Spanish. I spent the morning sitting at a folding table near the entrance, talking with families about their situations and helping them fill out the paperwork required for assistance. There was Maria, a young mother whose husband had been deported 3 months ago, leaving her to care for twin toddlers on a part-time house-cleaning salary. There was Carlos, a construction worker whose back injury had put him out of work for 6 weeks while he waited for workers' compensation payments that might never come. There was Elena, an elderly woman whose apartment building was being converted to condos, forcing her to choose between paying the increased rent or buying her heart medication. Each story was different, but they all shared the same thread: people who had been working, contributing, living independently until circumstances beyond their control knocked them off balance. These weren't the dangerous criminals Amanda had imagined, but families and individuals trying to maintain their dignity while navigating impossible choices. Around 11:30, I was helping Elena understand the paperwork when I noticed a familiar silver BMW pull up outside. Through the window, I could see Amanda in the driver's seat, checking her phone and looking increasingly impatient. She was early, and I still had 30 minutes left on my volunteer shift. I excused myself and walked outside, expecting to explain that I needed a few more minutes to finish my responsibilities. But Amanda's expression when she saw me stopped the words in my throat. "Nancy, what are you wearing?" I looked down at my clothes: comfortable jeans, a plain cotton blouse, and the apron Mrs. Chen had given me with the food bank's logo on the front. It was practical clothing for volunteer work, nothing fancy but clean and appropriate. "I'm helping with intake forms. Mrs. Chen asked me to." "You look like you work here." Amanda's voice carried a tone I'd never heard before, something between embarrassment and disgust. "Miguel said you were volunteering, not this." "This is volunteering, Amanda. I'm helping families who need assistance." She stared at me for a long moment, then glanced around at the people still waiting in line, at the volunteers loading boxes into cars, at the whole scene that represented everything she'd been trying to pull Miguel away from. "Get in the car, Nancy." "I'm not finished yet. My shift ends at—" "Get in the car now." The sharpness in her voice drew attention from several people nearby. I could feel their eyes on us, could sense the tension that was building, and I didn't want to cause a scene that might reflect poorly on the food bank or make things uncomfortable for the families still waiting for help. I went back inside to tell Mrs. Chen I needed to leave early, apologizing for the disruption and promising to return on Friday. She was gracious about it, but I could see the questions in her eyes, the concern that came from someone who recognized family conflict when she saw it. When I got back to the car, Amanda was sitting rigid in the driver's seat, her hands gripping the steering wheel like she was trying to keep herself from saying something she'd regret. "Amanda, I don't understand why you're upset. I was helping people, making a difference in—" "You were embarrassing yourself." She started the engine, with more force than necessary. "Nancy, you're a successful businesswoman. You own property, you have savings, you have options. What do you think people assume when they see you standing in line at a food bank wearing an apron? The words hit me like a physical blow. I wasn't standing in line. I was volunteering. There's a difference between, is there? Because from where I was sitting, you looked like just another client. Amanda pulled out of the parking lot, her movements sharp and agitated. Miguel's colleagues, our friends. What do you think they'd say if they knew his mother was hanging around food banks? What does that say about how well he's taking care of you? I stared out the window, watching the food bank disappear behind us, and felt something shift inside my chest. This wasn't about my safety or my independence or even my happiness. This was about Amanda's image, about maintaining the illusion that Miguel had successfully distanced himself from his humble origins. Miguel doesn't need to take care of me, Amanda. I take care of myself. Do you? Because volunteering at charity organizations isn't exactly a sign of financial stability, Nancy. It's what people do when they have too much time on their hands and need to feel useful. The car fell silent except for the hum of the air conditioning and the soft sound of Amanda's fingers drumming against the steering wheel. We were stopped at a red light, and I could see my reflection in the passenger window, a 73-year-old woman who had spent the morning helping her community and was now being lectured like a child who'd misbehaved. When we reached my building, Amanda didn't turn off the engine. Nancy, I think it's time we had an honest conversation about your future. Miguel loves you, but he can't keep worrying about whether you're making good decisions. The food bank thing, living alone above a business, refusing to consider your options, it's all connected. You're acting like someone who's lost perspective. I unbuckled my seatbelt but didn't immediately get out of the car. What does that mean exactly? Amanda turned to face me, and for a moment, her expression softened into something that might have been genuine concern. It means you're trying to hold on to a life that doesn't exist anymore. Roberto's gone, Miguel's moved on, the neighborhood has changed. You can keep pretending things are the same, or you can accept help and start planning for the reality of your situation. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. My situation? You're an elderly woman living alone with no family nearby. You're volunteering at charity organizations because you need to feel needed. You're resistant to change because change is scary at your age. Nancy, there's no shame in admitting you need support. She reached into her purse and pulled out a folder I hadn't noticed before. I've scheduled appointments at 3 different senior communities for this week. The first one is tomorrow at 10. I'll pick you up at 9:30. I took the folder without opening it, feeling like I was holding evidence of my own defeat. Amanda, I haven't agreed to. You don't have to agree to anything yet. Just look at your options. Talk to the staff. See what's available. If you decide none of them are right for you, we'll figure out something else. The something else hung in the air like a threat. I got out of the car and watched Amanda drive away, leaving me standing on the sidewalk with a folder full of brochures for places where people went when their families decided they were no longer capable of making their own decisions. That evening, Miguel called. Mom, Amanda told me about today. I'm sorry if she seemed frustrated, but she's worried about you. We both are. Miguel, I was volunteering. I was helping people. Why is that something to worry about? It's not the helping that concerns us, Mom. It's the judgment. Amanda thinks you might not be seeing the situation clearly. What situation? Your situation. Living alone, making decisions that might not be in your best interest, putting yourself in environments that could be. He paused, searching for words that wouldn't sound as harsh as the truth. Look, Mom, maybe it's time to consider some changes. Not because we don't love you, but because we want what's best for you. I closed my eyes and leaned against the kitchen counter where Roberto and I had shared thousands of meals, made countless decisions, built a life that had meaning and purpose. Miguel, What if what's best for me isn't what looks best to Amanda? Mom, please don't make this about Amanda. This is about family taking care of family. But as I hung up the phone, I realized that Amanda had already made it about much more than family. She'd made it about class, about shame, about erasing the parts of Miguel's history that didn't fit the narrative she'd constructed about their future together. The folder sat on my kitchen table all evening, its presence as heavy as a stone. I didn't open it, but I could feel it there, representing a future where other people made decisions about my life, where my independence became an inconvenience to be managed rather than a right to be respected. That night, I called Mrs. Chen. Nancy, I wanted to make sure everything was all right today. You seemed upset when you left. Mrs. Chen, can I ask you something? When people volunteer at the food bank, do you think it reflects poorly on their families? There was a long pause. Nancy, volunteering here reflects well on everyone involved. It means you believe in community, in helping others, in using your time for something meaningful. Anyone who sees that as negative probably doesn't understand what service really means. After we hung up, I sat in Roberto's chair and looked around the apartment that held 50 years of memories. Tomorrow, Amanda would come to take me to look at senior living facilities where I could be safe, supervised, and separated from the messy realities of the neighborhood I'd called home for decades. But tonight, I was still Nancy Martinez, still the woman who had built a business from nothing, still the person who chose to spend her Tuesday mornings helping families who needed support. Whatever tomorrow brought, tonight, I was still myself, and that had to count for something. The next morning came too early, preceded by another restless night where I found myself walking through the apartment at 3 a.m, touching familiar objects like they might anchor me to something solid. The coffee maker gurgled to life just as Amanda's car pulled up outside, its engine purring with the kind of expensive efficiency that reminded me how different our worlds had become. I had dressed carefully that morning, choosing a navy blue dress that Roberto had always complimented and the pearl earrings he'd given me for our 25th anniversary. If I was going to be paraded through senior living facilities like livestock at auction, I would at least look like someone who had once commanded respect. Amanda knocked instead of using the buzzer, a small courtesy that felt almost mocking given the circumstances. When I opened the door, she was holding 2 coffee cups from the expensive chain across town, the kind that charged $6 for what I could make better in my own kitchen. Good morning, Nancy. I brought you a vanilla latte. I thought you might need the caffeine. I accepted the cup without enthusiasm, tasting the artificial sweetness that couldn't quite mask the bitter undertone of obligation. Amanda was being kind in her way, which somehow made everything worse. It would have been easier if she'd been openly cruel instead of wrapping her control in layers of concern and consideration. Are you ready to go? I've scheduled us to see Sunset Manor first. It's the most expensive, but I think you'll appreciate the amenities. The ride to the first facility was filled with Amanda's commentary about property values, waiting lists, and the importance of securing a spot before the best ones were taken. She spoke about my future living arrangements the way she might discuss investment portfolios or vacation destinations, with clinical detachment and absolute certainty that her research had identified the optimal solutions. The thing about these places, she explained while navigating through traffic, is that they fill up fast. The good ones have waiting lists years long, so even if you're not ready to move immediately, it's smart to get your name down. I stared out the window at the city I'd called home for 73 years, watching familiar neighborhoods give way to manicured suburbs where every lawn looked identical and every house seemed designed to keep the world at a safe distance. Sunset Manor sat on a hill overlooking a man-made lake, its brick facade and colonial columns designed to suggest permanence and prosperity. The circular driveway was lined with perfectly maintained flower beds that screamed of professional landscaping, rather than anyone's personal touch. A valet in a burgundy vest approached our car before we'd even come to a complete stop. Welcome to Sunset Manor. Are you here for a tour? Amanda smiled with the satisfaction of someone who'd chosen well. Yes, we have an appointment with Jennifer at 10. Jennifer turned out to be a woman in her 30s with aggressively blonde hair and a smile that never wavered, even when discussing the most mundane details of institutional living. She wore a blazer that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent and spoke with the kind of practiced enthusiasm that made every amenity sound life-changing. Mrs. Martinez, I'm so excited to show you around today. Sunset Manor isn't just a place to live. It's a community designed around active, engaged seniors who want to make the most of their golden years. The tour began in the lobby, a soaring space with marble floors and a chandelier that belonged in a hotel rather than a residence. Everything was beautiful and sterile, designed to impress rather than comfort. Jennifer pointed out the grand piano where residents could enjoy evening concerts, the library with its collection of large print bestsellers, and the gift shop that sold overpriced trinkets and flowers. Our dining room seats 250 residents and guests, Jennifer announced as we entered a space that looked like a corporate cafeteria disguised as a country club. We have a full-time chef who prepares 3 meals a day, plus snacks and beverages available around the clock. The menu posted by the entrance featured bland descriptions of comfort foods that bore no resemblance to anything I'd ever considered comforting. Salisbury steak with mushroom gravy, turkey meatloaf with mashed potatoes, baked chicken breast with steamed vegetables. Everything sounded like it had been designed by a committee of nutritionists who'd never actually tasted their own recommendations. Do residents ever cook for themselves? I asked. Jennifer's smile flickered slightly. Oh, there's no need for that here. Our kitchenettes are mainly for storing snacks or making coffee. The dining plan is included in your monthly fee, so why would you want to cook? Why indeed? Why would anyone want to create something with their own hands, to fill their living space with the smells of garlic and onions and fresh herbs, to maintain the connection between nourishment and love that had defined my entire adult life? Amanda was nodding enthusiastically at everything Jennifer said, asking questions about housekeeping services and transportation schedules and social activities. She seemed genuinely excited by the prospect of me living somewhere that would manage every aspect of my existence, leaving me free to pursue approved recreational activities under professional supervision. And this is one of our deluxe one-bedroom units, Jennifer announced, opening the door to what could charitably be called an apartment. It was clean and modern, and completely devoid of personality, with neutral carpeting and generic furniture that could have been ordered from a catalog. The kitchenette consisted of a small refrigerator, a microwave, and a coffee maker, surrounded by cabinets that would barely hold a week's worth of groceries. The monthly fee includes all utilities, basic cable, internet, and access to our full range of amenities, Jennifer continued. Many residents tell us it's the first time in years they've felt truly carefree. Carefree. The word hung in the air like dust motes in afternoon sunlight, beautiful and ultimately meaningless. I thought about my apartment above the bakery, with its uneven floors and temperamental plumbing and walls that held decades of memories. It wasn't carefree, but it was mine in a way this sterile box could never be. What's the monthly cost? I asked, though Amanda had already shown me the figures. For the deluxe one-bedroom, we're looking at $4,500 per month, which includes everything I mentioned, plus our basic care plan. If you need additional assistance with daily activities, we offer enhanced services for an additional fee. $4,500 to live in a place where someone else decided what I would eat, when I would eat it, and how I would spend my days. $4,500 to give up the independence Amanda claimed to be protecting. The tour continued. Through common areas designed to encourage socialization among people who might have nothing in common except their age and their family's desire to see them safely contained. There was a craft room where residents could make simple projects under supervision, an exercise facility with equipment designed for people with limited mobility, and a beauty salon where appointments could be scheduled to help residents look their best. We also have a full calendar of activities, Jennifer explained, handing me a glossy brochure filled with photographs of elderly people looking delighted to participate in bingo games and ice cream socials. Movie nights, guest speakers, holiday parties, shopping trips to the mall. There's always something happening here. Always something happening, but nothing that required real engagement or personal investment. Nothing that challenged residents to grow or contribute or remain connected to the world beyond these walls. Just a series of pleasant distractions designed to pass time until there was no more time to pass. Amanda was asking about waiting lists and move-in procedures, clearly sold on the idea that this represented the best possible future for me. She admired the controlled environment, the professional staff, the absence of anything that might require difficult decisions or uncomfortable compromises. Jennifer, what happens if someone's health declines? Do they have to move to a different facility? We have partnerships with excellent assisted living and memory care facilities in the area. When residents reach the point where they need more support than we can provide, we help coordinate the transition to ensure continuity of care. Continuity of care. Another euphemism for the gradual stripping away of independence until nothing remained but the illusion of dignity in a place where dignity was just another service provided by professionals. As we prepared to leave, Jennifer handed me a packet of information and application forms. Mrs. Martinez, I hope you'll seriously consider making Sunset Manor your home. We have a wonderful community here, and I think you'd fit right in. Fit right in. The phrase echoed in my mind as Amanda drove us to the second facility, this one called Golden Years Residence, and located even farther from anything I recognized as home. This place was slightly less expensive and correspondingly less luxurious, but it offered the same basic package of managed existence wrapped in cheerful efficiency. The tour guide here was an older woman named Patricia, who'd been a resident herself for 3 years before joining the staff. She spoke with the enthusiasm of a convert, describing how moving here had freed her from the burdens of maintaining a house and managing her own affairs. I used to worry about everything, Patricia explained as we walked through common areas that looked like a mid-priced hotel. Property taxes, home maintenance, grocery shopping, cooking, cleaning. Now I just wake up each morning and decide how I want to spend my day. It's liberating. Liberating to have no responsibilities, no challenges, no connection to anything, beyond the scheduled activities and shared meals that comprised life within these walls. I watched Patricia's face as she described her daily routine, seeing something that might have been contentment, but looked more like resignation, dressed up as satisfaction. The third facility, Harmony Gardens, was the least expensive and most honest about what it offered. The director, a no-nonsense woman named Carol, didn't pretend that institutional living was a luxury resort experience. Mrs. Martinez, we provide clean, safe housing with basic services for seniors who need some support, but want to maintain as much independence as possible. We're not fancy, but we're affordable, and we treat our residents with respect. The apartments here were smaller, and the amenities more limited, but there was something refreshingly straightforward about Carol's presentation. She didn't oversell the experience or promise transformation through relocation. She simply offered what she had and let potential residents decide if it met their needs. We encourage residents to personalize their spaces as much as possible, Carol explained, showing us a unit that looked lived in rather than staged. Some people bring their own furniture, family photographs, whatever makes them feel at home. We want this to be your home, not just a place where you're temporarily housed. It was the first time anyone had used the word home in a way that suggested they understood what the concept actually meant. Not just a place to sleep and eat, but a space that reflected the person who lived there, that held meaning beyond its functional purpose. But even Carol's honest approach couldn't change the fundamental reality of what was being offered. A small apartment in a building full of strangers, meals prepared by institutional kitchens, activities planned by staff members, A life circumscribed by other people's ideas about what was appropriate for someone my age. On the drive back to my real home, Amanda was practically vibrating with excitement about the possibilities we'd explored. I think Sunset Manor is definitely the best option, even though it's the most expensive. The amenities are incredible, and the staff seems so professional. You'd be completely taken care of there. Completely taken care of. The phrase made my skin crawl. Amanda, can I ask you something? Do you think Miguel would be happy living in one of those places? She glanced at me sharply. Miguel isn't 73 years old, Nancy. He doesn't need that level of support. What if he did? What if something happened to him tomorrow and he needed a safe place to live? Would you want him somewhere like Sunset Manor? That's different. Miguel has family to take care of him. He has options. I have family too. I have options too. Amanda's grip on the steering wheel tightened. Nancy, your options are limited. By your age and your circumstances. These facilities exist because families can't always provide the level of care that elderly relatives need. What level of care do you think I need, Amanda? Supervision, structure, social interaction with people your own age, professional support if your health declines or if you have an emergency. And what if I don't want any of those things? What if I want to keep living my own life in my own way? Amanda pulled into the parking space in front of my building and turned off the engine. For a moment, we sat in silence, the weight of unspoken truths filling the space between us. Nancy, what you want isn't always what's best for you. Miguel and I have researched this carefully. We've talked to doctors, social workers, people who understand the challenges of aging. You can't just ignore reality because it's not what you prefer. Whose reality? Mine or yours? The reality where you're an elderly woman living alone above a commercial business in a neighborhood that's becoming less safe every year. The reality where you're volunteering at charity organizations instead of enjoying the retirement you've earned. The reality where Miguel worries about you constantly because you won't accept that you need help. I unbuckled my seatbelt and reached for the door handle but didn't immediately get out of the car. Amanda, what if the help you think I need isn't help at all? What if it's just a way of making yourself and Miguel feel better about not being involved in my daily life? Her reflection in the windshield went very still. What's that supposed to mean? It means that putting me in an expensive facility where other people are paid to worry about me might solve your problem, but it doesn't solve mine. What problem do you think you have, Nancy? I looked up at the building where I'd lived for 47 years, where Roberto and I had raised our son and built our business and created a life that mattered to us and to the community around us. The problem of being treated like a burden instead of a person. The problem of having my choices dismissed because they're not what you would choose. The problem of being pushed out of my own life so that other people can feel good about the decisions they're making for me. Amanda was quiet for a long moment, her fingers drumming against the steering wheel in the pattern I'd learned to recognize as her way of controlling her temper. Nancy, I'm trying to help you. Miguel is trying to help you. The fact that you can't see that suggests that maybe your judgment isn't as clear as you think it is. I got out of the car and leaned down to look at her through the open window. My judgment is fine, Amanda. It's your understanding that needs work. That evening, Miguel called while I was making dinner for myself. Something simple but satisfying that filled the apartment with familiar smells and reminded me why cooking mattered. Mom, Amanda told me about the tours today. She said you seemed resistant to all the options. I wasn't resistant, Miguel. I was evaluating whether any of those places offered something I actually want or need. And your conclusion? My conclusion is that they're very nice places for people who want other people to manage their lives. I'm not one of those people. Mom, nobody's talking about managing your life. We're talking about making sure you have support when you need it. Miguel, when have I ever asked you for support I couldn't get living where I am now? There was a long pause. It's not about what you've asked for. It's about what might happen. What if you fall and can't reach the phone? What if you get sick and don't have anyone to check on you? What if something goes wrong with the building or the business? Miguel, what if something goes wrong with your house? What if Amanda gets sick? What if you lose your job? Should you move into an assisted living facility just in case something bad happens? That's not the same thing, Mom. Why not? Because we're not 73 years old. Age isn't the only factor that determines whether someone can live independently, Miguel. Health, mental capacity, financial resources, social support, personal preference, all of those matter too. And by all of those measures, I'm doing fine. But for how long? Mom, Amanda, and I are thinking about the future, not just the present. Whose future? Mine or yours? Another pause, longer this time. What do you mean? I mean that the future you and Amanda are planning for me looks a lot more convenient for you than it does beneficial for me. Mom, that's not fair. Isn't it? Miguel, when was the last time you visited me just because you wanted to spend time with me, not because you felt obligated or because Amanda thought you should check on me? The silence stretched so long I thought he might have hung up. Miguel, I'm here, Mom. I'm just thinking. About what? About whether you're right. About whether we've been so focused on solving problems that we forgot to ask if you actually think you have problems that need solving. It was the first crack in the facade I'd seen from my son in years. The first indication that he might be capable of questioning the narrative Amanda had constructed about my life and my needs. Miguel, I don't need to be rescued. I need to be respected. There's a difference. I know, Mom. I don't know how to balance taking care of you with letting you take care of yourself. You don't have to balance anything, mijo. You just have to trust that the woman who raised you to make good decisions might still be capable of making good decisions. After we hung up, I sat in the kitchen for a long time, looking at the application packets Amanda had left with me. 3 different ways of giving up my independence in exchange for the illusion of security. 3 different prices for admission to a world where other people would decide what constituted a meaningful life. I thought about the food bank, about Mrs. Chen and the volunteers who gave their time because they believed in community and mutual support. I thought about the families I'd helped register that morning, people who were facing real challenges but maintaining their dignity and their determination to create better lives for themselves and their children. None of those people would be welcome at Sunset Manor or Golden Years Residence, or even Harmony Gardens. The cost alone would exclude them, but more than that, the philosophy behind those places would reject everything that made them who they were. Their struggles, their resilience, their connections to family and community and culture, all of it would be seen as complications to be managed rather than strengths to be celebrated. I opened the first application packet and began reading through the requirements and restrictions that would govern life in Amanda's vision of my future. No pets, no cooking with open flames, no overnight guests without prior approval, no personal vehicles, no leaving the property without signing, out and providing an expected return time. Each rule was presented as a safety measure, a way of protecting residents from the dangers of independent living. But taken together, they formed a cage as complete as any prison, just decorated with better furniture and served with more appetizing meals. I picked up the phone and called Mrs. Chen. Nancy, how are you? I hope everything worked out all right yesterday. Mrs. Chen, I wanted to ask you about something. Have you ever had volunteers who were pressured by their families to stop volunteering? Oh my, yes. It's more common than you might think. Adult children who think their parents should be taking it easy, spouses who worry about safety, families who think volunteer work is beneath their social status. It's always heartbreaking when someone wants to help, but feels they can't because of family pressure. What do you tell people in that situation? I tell them that service to others is never something to be ashamed of, regardless of what anyone else thinks. I also tell them that they're adults with the right to make their own decisions about how to spend their time and energy, even if their families think they're making poor choices. Nancy, in my experience, families who pressure elderly relatives to stop volunteering are usually more concerned about appearances than they are about the volunteer's well-being. Real concern would involve asking what the person gets out of volunteering and finding ways to support that, not demanding that they stop. After we hung up, I made myself a cup of tea and sat on the small balcony outside my bedroom window, looking down at the street where I'd lived for nearly 5 decades. The bakery was closed for the evening, but I could see lights in the apartments above other businesses, families settling in for the night in homes they'd chosen for themselves. Tomorrow was Thursday, which meant Amanda would probably call to discuss my thoughts about the facilities we'd visited. She'd want to know which one I preferred when I was planning to submit applications, what additional information I needed to make my decision. What she wouldn't expect was for me to tell her that I'd already made my decision, just not the one she was hoping for. What she couldn't anticipate was that her efforts to prove I needed institutional care had instead convinced me that what I really needed was to reclaim control over my own narrative. I finished my tea and went inside to call my lawyer. If Amanda and Miguel were planning my future, it was time for me to start planning it too, but on my own terms with my own goals and my own definition of what would constitute a life worth living. The conversation with my lawyer, David Restrepo, lasted nearly an hour. David had handled the legal affairs for the bakery since Roberto's death, and he knew my financial situation better than my own family did. What he didn't know was how that financial security was currently being used as evidence of my supposed inability to make rational decisions about my living situation. Nancy, you're one of the most financially stable clients I have. Between the bakery income, your investments, and the property holdings, you could afford any living arrangement you wanted, including full-time private care in your own home if that's what you preferred. David, if someone wanted to argue that I was incompetent to manage my own affairs, what would they need to prove? It would be very difficult. You'd need to be declared mentally incapacitated by a court, and that would require medical evidence of cognitive decline or psychological impairment. Why are you asking? I explained the situation with Amanda and Miguel, the pressure to move into institutional care, the way my choices were being reframed as evidence of poor judgment. Nancy, as long as you're mentally competent, no one can force you to move anywhere or accept care you don't want. Your family can express their concerns and make recommendations, but the decision is ultimately yours to make. What if they argue that living alone at my age is inherently unsafe? Living alone isn't illegal or evidence of incompetence. Millions of elderly people live independently without supervision. Unless you're posing a danger to yourself or others, your living arrangement is your choice. And the volunteering? Could they use that as evidence that I'm not thinking clearly? David actually laughed. Nancy, volunteering is generally considered evidence of good judgment and social engagement. Any lawyer who tried to argue that charitable work indicated incompetence would be laughed out of court. The conversation was reassuring, but it also highlighted how completely Amanda misunderstood both my capabilities and my legal rights. She was operating from the assumption that age alone gave her and Miguel the authority to override my preferences. That concern automatically translated into control. That night, I did something I hadn't done in months. I called Lauren, Miguel's younger sister who lived in Portland with her husband and 2 teenage daughters. Lauren had always been the more independent of my 2 children, the one who'd inherited Roberto's quiet strength and my stubborn streak in equal measure. "Mommy, it's so good to hear your voice. How are you doing?" I told her about Amanda's campaign to relocate me, about the facility tours and the pressure to accept institutional care as the only reasonable option for someone my age. Lauren was quiet for a long moment after I finished. "Mommy, has Miguel actually seen these places? Has he spent time understanding what they're really offering?" "I don't think so. I think Amanda did the research and presented it to him as the obvious solution to problems I didn't know I had. And how do you feel about the whole thing? Like I'm being managed instead of supported. Like my preferences don't matter as much as their peace of mind. Mommy, can I ask you something? Do you actually need help with anything? I mean, real help, not hypothetical future help. I considered the question seriously. I'm healthy, financially secure, mentally sharp, socially connected, and happy with my life. If I needed help, I would ask for it. Then why is Amanda so convinced you need to move? Because she's uncomfortable with the life I've chosen to live. Because she thinks Miguel should be embarrassed by having a mother who lives above a bakery and volunteers at a food bank. Because she wants him to have a mother who fits better with the image she's created of their social status. Lauren sighed. Mommy, would it help if I talked to Miguel? Sometimes he listens to me differently than he listens to other people. I don't want to put you in the middle of this, mija. You're not putting me in the middle. I'm choosing to be involved because you're my mother and I love you, and I don't want you to be pushed into something that's wrong for you. The next morning, Amanda called earlier than usual, her voice bright with artificial enthusiasm. Nancy, I hope you had time to look over the information packets. I was thinking we should probably submit applications to at least 2 of the facilities, just to get the process started. Amanda, I've decided not to apply to any of them. The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had been dropped. Amanda? I'm here. Nancy, I don't think you understand the urgency of this situation. These places have waiting lists. If you wait too long to apply, you might not have options when you actually need them. I understand the urgency you feel. I don't share it. Nancy, this isn't about what you feel. This is about practical planning for inevitable changes in your health and capabilities. Amanda, my health and capabilities are fine. When they're not, I'll address the situation then, with the help of medical professionals who understand my actual needs rather than assumptions about what someone my age must need. You're being unrealistic. I'm being honest about my current situation and my personal preferences. If that seems unrealistic to you, maybe the problem isn't with my perspective. Amanda's breathing became audible, the kind of controlled inhaling and exhaling that suggested she was working very hard to maintain her composure. Nancy, Miguel, and I have invested a lot of time and energy into researching your options. We've tried to find solutions that would give you the support you need while maintaining your independence. I don't understand why you're refusing to even consider what we've found. Because what you've found solves your problems, not mine. You've found ways to ensure that I'm supervised and contained and no longer your responsibility. You haven't found ways to support the life I actually want to live. The life you want to live isn't sustainable. According to whom? According to reality, Nancy. According to statistics about aging and safety and the challenges of living alone at your age. Amanda, I'm not a statistic. I'm a person with my own circumstances and capabilities and preferences. When you reduce me to demographic data, you stop seeing me as an individual with the right to make my own choices. The conversation ended with Amanda saying she needed to discuss the situation with Miguel before we talked again. I hung up feeling exhausted, but also strangely exhilarated. For the first time in months, I'd defended my position without apologizing for it, without trying to make Amanda feel better about my refusal to comply with her plans. The afternoon brought an unexpected visitor. Mrs. Chen appeared at my door with a small potted plant and a worried expression. Nancy, I hope you don't mind me stopping by. I wanted to check on you after what happened on Tuesday. I invited her in and made coffee while she admired the photographs and artwork that covered my living room walls. She moved slowly through the space, taking in the evidence of a life fully lived, of relationships and experiences and accomplishments that couldn't be reduced to institutional care plans. This is beautiful, Nancy. You can feel the love in this place, the history. Mrs. Chen, can I ask you something? Do you think there's an age at which people automatically lose the right to make their own decisions about where and how to live? She set down her coffee cup and looked at me with the direct gaze of someone who'd spent years dealing with difficult truths. Nancy, I think there are people who lose the ability to make safe decisions for themselves, and when that happens, someone needs to step in. But I also think there are families who convince themselves their elderly relatives are incompetent because it's easier than respecting choices they don't agree with. How do you tell the difference? You listen to the person. You observe their daily functioning. You assess their decision-making process, not just their decisions. And most importantly, you start from the assumption that adults have the right to make choices you wouldn't make for yourself. Mrs. Chen reached into her purse and pulled out a small notebook. Nancy, I wanted to show you something. These are notes from conversations I've had with some of our regular volunteers over the past 2 years. People who've been pressured by their families to stop volunteering, to move into care facilities, to give up activities that brought them joy and purpose. She flipped through pages covered with neat handwriting, names and dates and brief summaries of family conflicts that mirrored my own situation. Margaret Chen, 79, stopped volunteering after her daughter threatened to move her into assisted living if she continued working with homeless families. Robert Santos, 81, gave up his position coordinating our food drives because his son said it was inappropriate for someone his age to be lifting boxes. Patricia Williams, 76, quit our literacy program because her daughter-in-law said tutoring adults was dangerous and beneath her social status. Each entry represented someone who'd been forced to choose between family harmony and personal fulfillment. Someone who'd been told that their desire to remain useful and engaged was evidence of poor judgment rather than admirable commitment. Mrs. Chen, what happened to those people after they stopped volunteering? They became smaller versions of themselves. They lost the sense of purpose that had kept them active and engaged. They started exhibiting the exact signs of decline their families had been worried about, but only after they'd been forced to give up the activities that had been keeping them vital. I thought about the residents I'd met during the facility tours, people who seemed pleasant but somehow diminished, like flowers that had been carefully preserved but had lost their fragrance in the process. Is that why you came here today? To convince me not to let my family pressure me into giving up my volunteer work? Mrs. Chen smiled. I came here because you're one of our most reliable volunteers, and also because you're one of our most generous supporters. Losing you would be devastating for the food bank, but losing your sense of purpose would be devastating for you. You know about the donations? Nancy, I've been running the food bank for 8 years. I know where our funding comes from, even when it's meant to be anonymous. Your monthly contributions are what keep us operational. Without that support, we'd have to cut services, reduce hours, maybe even close. I felt something shift in my chest, a recognition that my choice about where to live wasn't just about my own comfort and independence. It was about my ability to continue supporting causes that mattered to me, to remain connected to the community I'd been serving for 15 years. Mrs. Chen, if I moved into one of those senior facilities, would I still be able to volunteer at the food bank? Most of them discourage outside activities, especially anything that involves working with low-income populations. They'd probably suggest you participate in their own volunteer programs, things like helping with bingo games or reading to other residents. And the donations? You could certainly continue making donations, but institutional living tends to be expensive. Many residents find that the monthly fees consume more of their income than they expected, leaving less available for charitable giving. We sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, both of us understanding that we were discussing more than just my living arrangements. We were talking about the preservation of community connections, the protection of charitable resources, the maintenance of relationships that had taken years to develop. Nancy, can I share something with you? Something I probably shouldn't tell you? I nodded. Last month, we received a call from someone asking about your volunteer work here. They wanted to know if we thought you were competent to handle the responsibilities, whether we'd noticed any signs of confusion or poor judgment, whether we thought your family should be concerned about your safety. My blood went cold. Who called? They didn't identify themselves, but it was a woman with an educated accent. She said she was doing research about volunteer programs for elderly people. Amanda. Amanda had called the food bank to gather evidence for her case that I was making. Poor decisions, that my volunteer work was a sign of diminished capacity rather than active engagement. What did you tell her? I told her that volunteer information is confidential and that if she had concerns about a specific volunteer, she should discuss them with that person directly. But Nancy, the fact that someone is investigating your activities suggests that there's more going on here than just family concern about your living situation. That evening, I called David Restrepo again. David, if someone were trying to build a case for having me declared incompetent, what kind of evidence would they gather? They'd look for patterns of poor judgment, unsafe behavior, financial mismanagement, social isolation, inability to care for yourself. They'd also interview people who interact with you regularly to see if they've noticed cognitive decline or concerning changes in your behavior. And if all the evidence pointed to someone who was financially stable, socially engaged, physically healthy, and mentally sharp, then they wouldn't have a case. Nancy, has someone threatened to pursue guardianship proceedings? Not directly, but I think someone might be gathering information just in case. My advice is to document everything. Keep records of your daily activities, your financial transactions, your medical appointments, your social interactions. If someone does try to challenge your competency, you'll want evidence of your continued ability to manage your own affairs. I spent the next 2 hours creating a detailed timeline of my activities over the past month, documenting everything from grocery shopping to volunteer work to social visits with friends. On paper, my life looked like exactly what it was: the daily routine of a healthy, independent, socially connected adult who happened to be 73 years old. But I also knew that Amanda wouldn't give up easily. She'd invested too much time and energy into the project of relocating me to accept defeat gracefully. If reasonable persuasion hadn't worked, she'd escalate to more aggressive tactics, and I needed to be prepared for whatever came next. The next morning brought another phone call from Miguel, but this time his tone was different. Less confident, more questioning. "Mom, I talked to Lauren last night." "How is she?" "She's fine, but she asked me some questions I couldn't answer." "What kind of questions?" "Questions about why Amanda and I think you need institutional care when you seem to be managing fine on your own. Questions about whether we've actually identified problems that need solving, or whether we're just uncomfortable with your choices." I waited, giving him space to work through whatever Lauren had helped him see. The question hung in the air between us, weighted with years of unspoken tensions and assumptions that had never been examined. Miguel's voice carried a vulnerability I hadn't heard since he was a child, asking if the monsters under his bed were real. "Do I feel what, mijo?" "Do you feel like Amanda and I have been treating you fairly? Like we've been listening to what you actually want, instead of just deciding what we think is best for you?" I closed my eyes and thought about how to answer honestly without destroying the fragile opening he was offering. "Miguel, I feel like you love me and want me to be safe. But I also feel like somewhere along the way you stopped seeing me as someone capable of knowing what's best for myself. When did that happen? When did I stop trusting your judgment?" "I think it happened gradually, after your father died. Amanda was worried about me being alone, and her worry became your worry, and somehow that worry turned into certainty that I couldn't handle my own life anymore." Miguel was quiet for a long time. When he spoke again, his voice was small. "Mom, are you unhappy?" I wasn't unhappy until I started feeling like I had to justify every choice I made to people who'd already decided my choices were wrong. But the volunteering at the food bank, living alone above the bakery, not wanting to move somewhere safer, don't you understand why those things worry us? Miguel, what worries you more? The possibility that something bad might happen to me, or the certainty that something bad will happen to me if I'm forced to give up everything that makes my life meaningful? Another long pause. I never thought about it that way. Your father and I raised you to be independent, to make your own decisions, to build a life that reflected your values and priorities. When did you decide that those skills have an expiration date? Amanda says, Miguel, I need you to stop telling me what Amanda says and start telling me what you think. What do you actually observe when you spend time with me? Not what someone else tells you to worry about, but what you see with your own eyes. I could hear him breathing, could almost feel him struggling to separate his own perceptions from the narrative Amanda had constructed about my declining capabilities and poor judgment. When I see you, Mom, you seem like yourself. Maybe a little lonelier since Dad died, but still sharp, still independent, still the woman who taught me how to think for myself. Then why are we having conversations about moving me into institutional care? Because Amanda says that what I see isn't the whole picture, that you might be hiding problems from me, or that you might not recognize signs of decline in yourself. Miguel, do you think I'm hiding problems from you? No. Do you think I've lost the ability to recognize when I need help? No. Then what's driving this urgency to change my living situation? The silence stretched so long I wondered if he'd hung up. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. I think Amanda is embarrassed by how you live. I think she wants me to have a mother who fits better with the life she's trying to build for us. The admission hit me like a physical blow, not because it was surprising, but because it was the first time Miguel had acknowledged what I'd known for months. Amanda wasn't concerned about my safety or happiness. She was concerned about her image, about what my choices said about Miguel's success and social status. Miguel, how do you feel about that? Confused, guilty, angry at myself for not seeing it sooner. And how do you feel about me? Proud. I'm proud of who you are, how you've handled losing Dad, how you've kept the business running, how you still find ways to help other people. I'm proud that you're my mother. I felt tears sliding down my cheeks, the first ones I'd shed since this whole ordeal began. Not tears of sadness or frustration, but tears of relief that my son was still in there somewhere, still capable of seeing me clearly when he wasn't looking through the lens of Amanda's anxieties. Miguel, I need you to understand something. I don't need to be rescued from my life. I need to be supported in living it the way I choose. There's a difference. I know, Mom. I'm starting to understand that. And I need you to decide whether you're going to stand with me or against me in this. Because Amanda isn't going to give up just because you've had one conversation with your sister. What do you mean? I told him about the phone call to the food bank, about Amanda's investigation into my volunteer work, about the way she was gathering evidence to support her case that I was making poor decisions. Miguel's sharp intake of breath told me he hadn't known about any of it. Mom, I had no idea Amanda was doing that. That's completely inappropriate. Miguel, your wife is building a case for having me declared incompetent so she can force me into institutional care. She's not just expressing concern. She's actively working to undermine my independence. That's not what she told me she was doing. What did she tell you she was doing? Research. She said she was researching volunteer programs to make sure the food bank was a safe environment for elderly volunteers. And you believed that? Miguel sighed heavily. I wanted to believe it. It was easier than confronting the possibility that she might have other motives. The conversation continued for another hour, with Miguel asking questions he should have asked months ago and finally hearing answers he'd been too influenced by Amanda to consider. By the time we hung up, something fundamental had shifted between us. Not back to the way things were before Amanda's campaign began, but forward to something new. A relationship between two adults who respected each other's autonomy and judgment. But I knew that Amanda wouldn't accept Miguel's change of perspective without a fight. She'd invested too much in the project of relocating me to abandon it just because her husband was having second thoughts. If anything, Miguel's newfound support for my independence would probably convince her that more drastic measures were necessary. I spent the weekend preparing for whatever Amanda's next move might be. I organized my financial records, documented my daily activities, and scheduled a comprehensive physical exam with my doctor to establish a current baseline of my health and cognitive function. If Amanda wanted to challenge my competency, I would be ready with evidence that contradicted every assumption she'd made about my capabilities. Monday morning brought the inevitable phone call, but Amanda's tone was different this time. Cooler, more formal, like she was reading from a script. "Nancy, Miguel told me about your conversation on Friday. I'm disappointed that you've chosen to frame this situation as a conflict between us rather than recognizing that we're all working toward the same goal." "What goal is that, Amanda?" "Ensuring your safety and well-being as you age. But if you're not willing to participate in planning for your future, then we need to explore other options." "What other options?" "Miguel and I have consulted with an elder care attorney about our legal responsibilities as your family members. We've learned that if we have genuine concerns about your ability to make safe decisions, we may need to petition for guardianship to protect you from yourself." There it was. The threat I'd been expecting, delivered with the kind of clinical detachment that suggested Amanda had rehearsed this conversation. She wasn't bluffing. She was giving me a final ultimatum disguised as legal advice. "Amanda, on what grounds would you petition for guardianship?" "Your refusal to accept appropriate housing for someone your age. Your insistence on volunteering in potentially dangerous environments. Your isolation from social connections appropriate to your demographic. Your resistance to family input about important life decisions." Each point was carefully constructed to sound reasonable to someone who didn't know the full context. My refusal to move into institutional care became resistance to appropriate housing. My volunteer work became exposure to dangerous environments. My independence became isolation. My autonomy became resistance to family input. "Amanda, have you discussed this legal strategy with Miguel?" "Miguel understands that sometimes families have to make difficult decisions to protect elderly relatives who can't see clearly enough to protect themselves." "Did he agree to pursue guardianship proceedings?" A pause. "Miguel is conflicted, but he'll do what's necessary when he understands the full situation." "What full situation?" "The situation where his mother is putting herself at risk and refusing help from people who love her. The situation where she's making choices that suggest diminished capacity and poor judgment." I felt a cold rage building in my chest, the kind of anger that comes from being systematically lied about by someone who claims to care about your well-being. "Amanda, I'm going to tell you something, and I want you to listen very carefully. I am a competent adult with full legal rights, and the financial resources to defend those rights. If you pursue guardianship proceedings against me, I will fight you with every tool at my disposal. And when I win, and I will win, I will make sure Miguel understands exactly what you tried to do to his mother." "Nancy, threats won't change the reality of your situation. The reality of my situation is that I'm a healthy, financially secure, mentally competent adult who happens to disagree with your preferences about how I should live my life. If you think that constitutes grounds for guardianship, I suggest you consult with a better lawyer." I hung up and immediately called David Restrepo. "David, I need to know everything about guardianship proceedings in this state. What Amanda would need to prove, what my rights are, how to protect myself if she follows through on her threat." "Nancy, guardianship is a serious legal action that essentially strips someone of their civil rights. The burden of proof is high, and the person seeking guardianship would need clear evidence of incapacity. Based on what you've told me about your situation, any competent judge would dismiss such a petition. But she could still file it? Anyone can file a petition, but frivolous guardianship proceedings can result in sanctions against the petitioner. If Amanda's lawyer has any sense, he'll advise her that she doesn't have a case. And if she finds a lawyer who's willing to file anyway, then we document everything. Your medical records, your financial management, your daily activities, your social connections. We build a comprehensive picture of your competency that would be impossible to challenge successfully. That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done in years. I called a family meeting. Not the kind of gathering Amanda usually orchestrated around holiday meals or birthday celebrations, but a formal meeting where everyone would have a chance to speak and be heard without interruption or interpretation. I called Miguel first. Mijo, I need you and Amanda to come over tomorrow evening. There are things we need to discuss as a family, and I want everyone to hear the same information at the same time. Mom, what kind of things? Things about my life, my choices, and my future. Things that affect all of us, but ultimately need to be decided by me. I called Lauren next. Mija, can you fly out here for a couple days? I need family support for a conversation I'm having with Miguel and Amanda. Of course, Mommy. What kind of support do you need? I need a witness. I need someone who loves me to be present when I explain why I won't be bullied into giving up my independence. Lauren's flight arrived Tuesday afternoon, and I picked her up at the airport in the small car I'd owned for 15 years. Another piece of evidence Amanda would probably cite as proof of my poor judgment, since the car was old and I was old, and therefore both were presumably unsafe. Mommy, you look good, Lauren said as we drove through the city toward home. Tired, maybe, but strong. I feel strong, Mija. Stronger than I've felt in months. Tell me everything. Not just the facts, but how you're feeling about all of it. I spent the drive explaining the progression of Amanda's campaign, from subtle suggestions about senior living to outright threats about guardianship proceedings. Lauren listened without interrupting, her expression growing more serious with each detail. Mommy, this isn't about your safety or your well-being. This is about control. I know. And Miguel? Where does he stand now? Miguel is confused and conflicted, but I think he's starting to see the situation more clearly. The question is whether he'll have the courage to stand up to Amanda when it matters. And if he doesn't, then I'll handle this without him. I'd rather have my son's support, but I don't need it to maintain my independence. We spent Tuesday evening cooking together in my small kitchen, preparing a meal that would remind everyone present of who I was and what I was capable of. Lauren helped me make Roberto's favorite dishes, mole poblano that required 12 different ingredients and 3 hours of careful attention, fresh tortillas rolled by hand, rice and beans seasoned with herbs from my fire escape garden. Mommy, this smells like home, Lauren said as we worked side by side. Like the home Miguel and I grew up in. That's the point, Mija. I want Amanda to see what she's asking Miguel to walk away from. I want her to understand what she's trying to take from all of us. Wednesday evening arrived with the weight of an impending storm. Miguel and Amanda came together, Amanda carrying a leather portfolio that probably contained more research about my supposed incapacity and inadequate living situation. She wore a navy suit that looked expensive and professional, like she was attending a business meeting rather than a family dinner. Lauren greeted them at the door with warmth that didn't quite hide her protective tension. She hugged Miguel with genuine affection and shook Amanda's hand with polite courtesy, the kind of greeting that established boundaries without creating obvious conflict. Something smells incredible, Miguel said, looking around the apartment, with eyes that seemed to be seeing it freshly. Mom, you've been cooking all day. Your sister helped. We wanted to make something special for family dinner. Amanda's smile was tight. Nancy, you really shouldn't go to so much trouble. Could have just met at a restaurant. I wanted to cook for my family in my own kitchen. It's important to me. We sat around the dining table Roberto and I had bought 45 years ago, the same table where Miguel had done his homework and brought friends for after school, snacks, and announced his engagement to Amanda 5 years earlier. The conversation during dinner was carefully neutral, focused on Lauren's flight and Miguel's work and the weather, all of us avoiding the topics that had brought us together. After dinner, Lauren helped me clear the dishes while Miguel and Amanda waited in the living room. I could hear them speaking in low voices, probably Amanda coaching Miguel about the points she wanted him to make during our discussion. "Mommy, are you ready for this?" Lauren asked quietly. "As ready as I can be. Remember, I just need you to witness what's said. Don't feel like you have to defend me or argue with Amanda. I can handle that myself." When we rejoined Miguel and Amanda, I took the chair across from them and Lauren sat beside me, close enough to offer silent support, but not so close as to suggest we were taking sides against them. "Thank you both for coming tonight," I began. "I wanted to have this conversation in my home, around my table, so we could speak honestly about the situation we're all facing." Amanda opened her portfolio. "Nancy, Miguel and I appreciate your hospitality, but we're here because we're concerned about some of the decisions you've been making lately. We've prepared some information that might help you understand our perspective." "Before you share your information, Amanda, I'd like to share some of mine." I reached for my own folder, much thicker than Amanda's, and placed it on the coffee table between us. "This contains documentation of my daily activities over the past month, my financial records, my medical information, and statements from people who interact with me regularly. I think you'll find it provides a comprehensive picture of my current capabilities and situation." Miguel looked confused. "Mom, why did you put together all this documentation?" "Because your wife threatened to pursue guardianship proceedings if I didn't comply with her demands about where I should live and how I should spend my time. I wanted to be prepared to defend my legal rights if necessary." Amanda's face went pale. "Nancy, that's not what I said. I said we were exploring our legal options to ensure your safety." "Amanda, you told me that you'd consulted with an elder care attorney about petitioning for guardianship. You said Miguel would do what was necessary when he understood the full situation. Those sound like threats to me." Miguel turned to look at Amanda with an expression I'd never seen before, shocked, hurt, and angry all at once. "Amanda, you told me you were researching guardianship procedures in case we ever needed that information in the future. You didn't tell me you were threatening Mom with legal action." "Miguel, I wasn't threatening anyone. I was trying to make Nancy understand that families have legal responsibilities when elderly relatives make unsafe decisions." "What unsafe decisions?" Lauren asked quietly. "Can you be specific about what Mom has done that puts her in danger?" Amanda pulled papers from her portfolio with the efficiency of someone who'd rehearsed this presentation. "Nancy insists on living alone above a commercial business in an increasingly unsafe neighborhood. She volunteers at a food bank that serves homeless people and drug addicts. She refuses to consider appropriate housing options for someone her age. She's resistant to family input about important life decisions." "Amanda," I said calmly, "have you actually spent time in my neighborhood recently? Have you talked to business owners or residents about safety concerns?" "I've researched crime statistics for this area. Burglary and assault rates have increased significantly over the past 5 years." "Have you researched crime statistics for the neighborhoods where those senior living facilities are located?" Amanda looked caught off guard. "That's different. Those facilities have security systems and professional staff. So does my building. We have security cameras, alarm systems, and I know every neighbor within 3 blocks. If something happened to me here, I'd have help within minutes." Miguel was studying Amanda's papers with the expression of someone seeing them for the first time. "Amanda, where did you get these crime statistics? Some of these numbers seem really high." "I found them online. There are websites that track neighborhood safety data. Mom, do these numbers match your experience of living here? Miguel, I've lived in this neighborhood for 47 years. I've seen it change, but I've never felt unsafe. I know which streets to avoid after dark, which neighbors to call if I need help, which businesses are owned by people I trust. That's not naivety. That's local knowledge that can't be replaced by internet research. Lauren leaned forward. Amanda, can I ask you something? Have you actually visited the food bank where Mom volunteers? Have you met Mrs. Chen or any of the other volunteers? I don't need to visit it personally to understand that it's an inappropriate environment for someone Nancy's age. Why is it inappropriate? Because it exposes her to unstable people who might take advantage of her or put her in danger. Have any unstable people actually threatened Mom or put her in danger? Amanda's jaw tightened. Not yet, but that doesn't mean it won't happen. Amanda, I said gently, you're asking me to give up activities that bring me joy and purpose because of problems that exist only in your imagination. You're asking me to move into institutional care to protect me from dangers you can't actually identify. I'm asking you to be realistic about the challenges of aging and to accept help before you need it desperately. What help do I need that I'm not already getting or couldn't get while continuing to live independently? Amanda pulled out another set of papers. Nancy, you're 73 years old. Statistics show that people your age have significantly increased risks of falls, cognitive decline, social isolation, and medical emergencies. Living alone magnifies all of those risks. Amanda, I'm not a statistic. I'm a specific person with specific circumstances that may or may not match demographic averages. Miguel set down the papers and looked directly at Amanda. Amanda, do you actually think Mom is showing signs of cognitive decline? I think she's showing signs of poor judgment about safety and appropriate activities for someone her age. That's not what I asked. Do you think she's losing her mental capacity? Amanda hesitated. I think she's not seeing situations clearly, because she's too emotionally attached to maintaining her independence. That's still not what I asked. Do you think there's something wrong with Mom's brain, her ability to think and reason and make decisions? The hesitation stretched longer. I think she's not making the decisions I would make in her situation. That's completely different from saying she's incapable of making decisions at all. Lauren spoke up. Amanda, can I share something with you? I'm a geriatric social worker. I assess elderly people's living situations and safety needs for a living. I've spent the past 2 days observing Mom, and I see absolutely no signs of cognitive impairment, physical decline, or inability to manage her own affairs. Amanda turned to stare at Lauren. You never mentioned that you work in elder care. You never asked about my job. You've been so focused on convincing Miguel that Mom needs institutional care that you never bothered to find out whether anyone in the family actually has professional expertise in this area. What's your professional assessment of Nancy's situation? My professional assessment is that she's a healthy, competent adult who's being pressured by family members to accept care she doesn't need because they're uncomfortable with her lifestyle choices. The room fell silent except for the sound of Amanda's papers rustling as she shuffled through them, looking for arguments that could counter Lauren's professional opinion. Lauren, even if Nancy seems competent now, shouldn't we be planning for future decline? Shouldn't we encourage her to move somewhere safer before something bad happens? Amanda, planning for future decline is reasonable. Forcing someone to give up their independence based on hypothetical future problems is not reasonable. Miguel had been quiet during this exchange, but now he spoke with a firmness I hadn't heard from him in years. Amanda, I need to understand something. Are you genuinely concerned about Mom's safety and well-being? Or are you uncomfortable with having a mother-in-law who lives above a bakery and volunteers at a food bank? Miguel, that's not fair. It's a fair question, because everything you've presented tonight is about what you think Mom should do, not about what she actually needs or wants. I think she should want to be safe and comfortable and surrounded by people her own age who understand the challenges of aging. But what if she wants something different? What if she wants to stay connected to the community where she's lived for 50 years? What if she finds meaning in helping other people rather than just participating in organized activities with other retirees? Amanda's composure finally cracked. Miguel, I'm trying to help you have a mother you can be proud of. I'm trying to help you move forward instead of being constantly worried about whether she's okay. The truth was finally out. Amanda wasn't concerned about my safety or happiness. She was concerned about my impact on Miguel's image and her own peace of mind. Amanda, Miguel said quietly, I am proud of my mother. I'm proud of how she's handled losing Dad, how she's maintained the business, how she continues to help other people even when she's dealing with her own challenges. I don't need her to live differently to make me proud of her. But the worry? Miguel, the constant worry about whether she's safe, whether she's making good decisions, whether something terrible is going to happen because she won't accept appropriate help. Amanda, whose worry is that? Because I wasn't constantly worried about Mom until you convinced me I should be. I watched Amanda's face as she realized that her carefully constructed case was collapsing. Miguel was questioning her assumptions. Lauren had professional credentials that contradicted her claims, and I had documentation that proved my competency. The narrative she'd built about my declining capabilities and poor judgment couldn't survive contact with actual evidence. I think, I said gently, that this conversation has clarified everyone's position. Amanda, you believe I should live differently than I choose to live. Miguel, you're beginning to understand that your worry about me has been based more on someone else's fears than on your own observations. Lauren, you've confirmed what I already knew, that I'm capable of continuing to make my own decisions about my life. Nancy, Amanda said, her voice tight with barely controlled frustration, what happens when you can't live independently anymore? What happens when you actually do need help? When that time comes, I'll ask for help. I'll work with medical professionals and family members to create a care plan that meets my actual needs. But I won't give up my independence based on the possibility that someday I might need to give it up. And if we're not comfortable with that uncertainty, then you'll need to find a way to become comfortable with it, because it's not your decision to make. Amanda gathered her papers and stood up with the rigid posture of someone who'd been thoroughly defeated, but wasn't ready to admit it. Miguel, I think we should go. Nancy has made her position clear. Miguel looked between Amanda and me, and I could see him making a choice that would affect all of our relationships going forward. Amanda, you go ahead. I'd like to stay and talk with Mom and Lauren for a while. Miguel, we need to discuss this situation as a couple. We will. But first I need to understand some things without your interpretation of what I should be thinking. After Amanda left, the three of us sat quietly for a few minutes, letting the tension dissipate and the truth settle between us. Mom, Miguel said finally, I owe you an apology. I let someone else's fears override my own judgment about your capabilities. I'm sorry. Mijo, you love your wife and you wanted to support her concerns. That's not something to apologize for. But I should have trusted my own observations instead of accepting her version of your situation. Lauren reached over and squeezed my hand. Mommy, what happens now? Do you think Amanda will back down? Or is this going to get worse before it gets better? I think Amanda invested too much in this project to give up easily. She may still try to pursue legal action, or she may try to convince Miguel that tonight was just me being manipulative and stubborn. Miguel shook his head. She won't convince me of anything. Tonight showed me who's been manipulative in this situation, and it wasn't you. Miguel, I don't want this to destroy your marriage. I want you to find a way to help Amanda understand that my independence doesn't threaten your relationship or your future together. Mom, If my marriage can't survive my mother living the life she chooses to live, then maybe it's not as strong as I thought it was. We talked until almost midnight, clearing the air about years of accumulated misunderstandings and unexpressed concerns. Miguel asked questions about my daily routine, my financial situation, my health, my social connections, all the things he should have asked before accepting Amanda's assessment of my needs. "Mom, can I ask you something? Are you ever lonely?" "Sometimes. I miss your father every day. But loneliness isn't the same as being unable to care for myself. Do you ever worry about getting older, about what might happen if your health changes?" "Of course I do, but I also trust that when changes come, I'll handle them the way I've handled every other challenge in my life, by asking for help when I need it and making the best decisions I can with the information I have." "And the food bank? The volunteering? Is that really important to you? Or are you just being stubborn because Amanda doesn't approve?" I smiled. "Miguel, that volunteer work connects me to something larger than myself. It reminds me that I still have something valuable to contribute. Taking that away from me would be like taking away part of who I am. Then I'll make sure no one takes it away from you." After Miguel and Lauren left, I sat in my quiet apartment and felt something I hadn't experienced in months: peace. Not the fragile peace that comes from avoiding conflict, but the deep peace that comes from standing up for yourself and discovering that you're strong enough to weather whatever storms that decision might bring. I called Mrs. Chen the next morning. "Nancy, how are you? I was hoping you'd be able to come in on Friday for our regular distribution day." "Mrs. Chen, I'll be there. And I wanted you to know that my family situation has been resolved. No one will be pressuring me to stop volunteering anymore." "I'm so glad to hear that. We need you here, Nancy. Not just for what you do, but for who you are." That afternoon, I received a call from David Restrepo. "Nancy, I wanted to follow up on our conversation about guardianship proceedings. Have there been any developments I should know about?" "The threat has been withdrawn. My family now understands that I'm perfectly capable of making my own decisions about my life." "I'm glad to hear it. But Nancy, I'd still recommend that you keep the documentation we discussed, just in case anyone else ever questions your competency." "David, can I ask you something? In your professional experience, how often do families pursue guardianship for reasons that aren't really about the elderly person's well-being?" "More often than you might think. Sometimes it's about control, sometimes it's about inheritance, sometimes it's about adult children who can't accept that their parents are still autonomous individuals. The law is supposed to protect against abuse, but the system isn't perfect. What advice would you give to other elderly people facing similar pressure from family members?" "Document everything. Maintain your medical records, your financial records, your social connections. Don't let anyone convince you that age alone makes you incompetent. And remember that you have legal rights that don't disappear just because your family disagrees with your choices." That evening, I did something I hadn't done since Roberto died. I called my neighbor Elena, the elderly woman I'd helped at the ICE food bank, and invited her for coffee. Not because I needed company, but because I wanted to extend the kind of community connection that made independence possible. "Señora Nancy, how wonderful to hear from you. Yes, I would love to have coffee with you tomorrow." We spent Friday afternoon sitting in my kitchen, sharing stories about our families and our neighborhoods and our strategies for staying connected to the communities we'd called home for decades. Elena told me about the pressure she was facing, from her own adult children to move into senior housing, pressure that sounded remarkably similar to what I'd just experienced with Amanda. "Señora Nancy, how do you help them understand that we're not ready to give up our lives just because we're getting older?" "Elena, I think you show them that aging doesn't automatically equal incapacity. You show them that you're still the same person who raised them and taught them to think for themselves. And if they don't listen, then you live your life anyway, and eventually they either learn to respect your choices or they learn to live with their discomfort about those choices. As Elena prepared to leave, she thanked me for the coffee and the conversation, but also for something more important. Señora Nancy, you remind me that we don't have to become smaller versions of ourselves just because other people think we should. Thank you for showing me that it's possible to fight for your independence and win. That night, I sat on my small balcony and looked down at the street where I'd lived for nearly 50 years. Tomorrow, I would go to the food bank and volunteer alongside people who understood that service to others was a privilege, not a burden. Next week, I would continue managing the bakery and the charitable trust that supported community organizations throughout the city. Next month, I would start planning the holiday meal I'd host for my family in this apartment, around this table, in the life I'd chosen to continue living. Amanda might never understand or approve of my choices, but that was her limitation, not mine. Miguel was beginning to see me clearly again, and Lauren had confirmed what I'd known all along, that competency wasn't measured by compliance with other people's expectations. I was 73 years old, financially secure, physically healthy, mentally sharp, and surrounded by community connections that had taken decades to build. I was also free to continue living my life according to my own values and priorities, answerable to no one but myself. The relief was overwhelming, but so was the recognition that my victory was small and personal and might not last. Other elderly people were facing similar pressure from families who confused control with care, who mistake compliance for safety, who couldn't distinguish between genuine concern and personal convenience. But tonight, at least, I was proof that it was possible to resist that pressure and maintain your independence even when the people who claimed to love you most were determined to take it away. Tonight, I was Nancy Martinez, and I was home. 3 weeks later, on a crisp October morning that carried the promise of winter, I found myself standing in the exact spot where this entire ordeal had begun. The Riverside Community Food Bank buzzed with its usual Tuesday morning activity, volunteers arranging donations and families arriving for assistance. But today felt different, charged with an energy that had nothing to do with the regular rhythm of service. Mrs. Chen had called me the previous evening with unusual excitement in her voice. "Nancy, could you come in a little early tomorrow? There's something special happening, and I think you'd want to be here." I arrived at 8:30 to find the parking lot fuller than usual, with several cars I didn't recognize, and a small group of people in business attire clustered near the entrance. Mrs. Chen met me at the door with a smile that seemed to contain secrets. "Nancy, I'm so glad you're here. We're having a special recognition ceremony today, and you're our guest of honor." Before I could ask what she meant, she guided me inside where I discovered that the usual setup had been transformed. Chairs were arranged in rows facing a small podium, banners hung from the ceiling, and a table near the front held what appeared to be certificates and small gifts. "Mrs. Chen, what's all this about?" "Nancy, do you remember when you first started volunteering here? You asked me if we ever recognized our long-term supporters, and I told you that the most generous donors preferred to remain anonymous." I felt a flutter of unease in my chest. "I remember." "Well, today we're breaking that tradition. Today, we're honoring someone whose support has made everything we do possible." The crowd began to settle into seats, and I recognized many faces from previous volunteer days. But there were also strangers. People in suits who looked like they might be from city government or local nonprofits, a woman with a camera who was clearly some kind of journalist, and several families I'd helped register over the past months. "Mrs. Chen, I think there's been some confusion. I'm just a volunteer who helps with intake forms." She smiled and squeezed my arm. "Nancy, you're much more than that. You're the reason this place exists." Before I could respond, she was walking to the podium and tapping the microphone to get everyone's attention. "Thank you all for coming this morning. The Riverside Community Food Bank has been serving our community for 15 years, and in that time, we've provided food assistance to over 50,000 families. We've been able to do this work because of the generosity of our donors, the dedication of our volunteers, and the partnership of organizations throughout the city. She paused and looked directly at me. But today, we want to recognize someone whose support has been extraordinary. For 15 years, since the day we opened our doors, one person has provided the foundation funding that keeps us operational. Monthly donations that cover our rent, our utilities, our staff salaries, and our equipment. Without this support, the food bank would have closed years ago. The unease in my chest was spreading. Mrs. Chen was going to announce my anonymous donations in front of all these people, destroying the privacy that Roberto and I had carefully maintained for over a decade. This donor has chosen to remain anonymous, working through a trust that simply identified them as a friend of the community. But recently, circumstances required us to verify the source of our funding, and we learned something remarkable. She gestured toward me, and I felt every eye in the room turn in my direction. Our most generous supporter, the person who has single-handedly kept this food bank running for 15 years, is also one of our most dedicated volunteers. Nancy Martinez, would you please come up here? The room erupted in applause, but I remained frozen in my seat. This wasn't supposed to happen. The donations were meant to be anonymous, private, a way of helping without drawing attention or expecting recognition. Mrs. Chen approached my chair. Nancy, everyone here knows you as the volunteer who helps families register for services, who speaks Spanish with parents who are struggling to communicate their needs, who brings homemade cookies for the staff and always stays late to help clean up. What they don't know is that you're also the person whose financial support makes all of this possible. She extended her hand to help me up, and I realized I had no choice but to acknowledge what had been revealed. The applause continued as I walked slowly to the front of the room, my mind racing through the implications of this public recognition. 15 years ago, Mrs. Chen continued, Nancy Martinez and her late husband Roberto established a trust that would provide ongoing support for community food assistance. Every month since then, we've received a check for $5,000, with no conditions, no requirements, no request for recognition. Just steady, reliable support that has allowed us to serve our neighbors in their time of need. I looked out at the faces in the crowd and saw a mixture of surprise, admiration, and something that looked like awe. Many of these people had interacted with me as a volunteer, treating me as a peer rather than a benefactor. Now they were learning that I was both. Nancy, Mrs. Chen said, turning to me. Would you like to say something? I stepped to the microphone, my hands trembling slightly. This is unexpected. Roberto and I never wanted recognition for our donations. We believed that helping others should be done quietly, without fanfare. But why? Called out a voice from the audience. It was Maria, the young mother whose husband had been deported, one of the first families I'd helped register. Why would you give so much and then come here to volunteer like the rest of us? I looked at Maria, remembering our conversation about her twins and her struggle to make ends meet on a house cleaning salary. Because giving money is easy when you have money. But understanding what people need, building relationships with the community, being present when families are facing their hardest moments, that requires showing up. That requires being here. Another voice from the crowd. Mrs. Martinez, did you know you were funding the food bank when you started volunteering? Of course I knew, but I wanted to understand how our donations were being used. I wanted to see if there were other ways I could help beyond just writing checks. Mrs. Chen nodded. And Nancy, you've helped in ways that go far beyond financial support. You've welcomed families, translated for Spanish-speaking clients, provided emotional support during intake interviews, and created a sense of community that money can't buy. I felt tears welling up in my eyes, not from embarrassment but from the recognition that Mrs. Chen understood something important. Roberto and I built our business by serving our community. When we started donating to the food bank, we weren't trying to be charitable. We were trying to be good neighbors. And that's exactly what you've been, said a man in the front row whom I recognized as Carlos, the construction worker with the back injury. Mrs. Martinez, when I came here 6 months ago, I was ashamed. I felt like I was begging, like I was less than the people who were helping me. But you talked to me like I was your equal, like my situation was temporary and my dignity was intact. More voices joined in, families sharing stories about their interactions with me, describing how I'd helped them navigate paperwork or connected them with other resources, or simply listened when they needed someone to understand their struggles. Mrs. Martinez, said Elena, the elderly woman who'd become my neighbor and friend. You could have just sent money and felt good about helping. Instead, you came here and let us help you understand what we really needed. Mrs. Chen stepped back to the microphone. Nancy, that's exactly why we wanted to honor you today. Not just for your financial generosity, but for your personal investment in this community. You've shown us that true support involves both resources and relationships. She picked up a framed certificate from the table. On behalf of the Riverside Community Food Bank, our staff, our volunteers, and the thousands of families we've served, we want to present you with this recognition of your 15 years of extraordinary support. The applause was thunderous, but I barely heard it. I was thinking about Amanda, about her horror at seeing me in this place, about her conviction that volunteering here was evidence of poor judgment and declining capacity. What would she think if she knew I wasn't just a volunteer but the primary reason this place existed? As the ceremony concluded and people began to mingle, I was surrounded by families I'd helped, volunteers I'd worked alongside, and staff members who'd become friends. Each person wanted to thank me, to share a story about how the food bank had made a difference in their lives, to express gratitude for support they'd never known came from someone they saw as a peer. Mrs. Martinez, said a young woman I didn't immediately recognize. I'm Sarah Chen, Mrs. Chen's daughter. I'm a reporter for the local newspaper, and I'd love to write a story about your support for the food bank. Would you be willing to do an interview? I hesitated. Sarah, I've never sought publicity for our donations. I'm not sure I want to start now. I understand your preference for privacy, but your story could inspire other people to get involved. Not just with money, but with their time and attention. You've shown that real community support requires both. Mrs. Chen overheard and approached us. Nancy, you don't have to do anything you're not comfortable with. But I will say this, your example has already inspired several other donors to become more involved. People who used to just send checks now come in to volunteer, to understand how their donations are being used. That afternoon, I found myself in an unexpected position. Word of the recognition ceremony had spread through the neighborhood, and I received phone calls from people I hadn't heard from in years. The baker who managed the shop below my apartment, neighbors from surrounding blocks, even some of Miguel's old friends who'd heard about the story through social media. Señora Nancy, said Mrs. Rodriguez, who lived above the hardware store. I had no idea you were the one keeping the food bank open. My family used their services last winter when my husband was in the hospital. We never knew we were receiving help from our neighbor. Each conversation reinforced something I'd been trying to explain to Amanda for months, that my life in this neighborhood wasn't about clinging to the past or refusing to accept my age. It was about maintaining connections to a community where I could contribute meaningfully and where my contributions made a real difference. Miguel called that evening, his voice filled with emotions I couldn't quite identify. Mom, I just saw the newspaper article online. I had no idea about the food bank donations. We never told you kids about our charitable giving. Your father and I believed that was private business. Mom, $5,000 a month for 15 years? That's almost $1 million. Miguel, it's money we were able to give because the bakery was successful and we lived modestly. We felt fortunate to be able to help. But Mom, why didn't you tell Amanda and me about this when we were pressuring you to stop volunteering? Why didn't you explain that you were the primary funder? I sat down in Roberto's chair and looked around the apartment that had been my home for almost 50 years. Miguel, would it have mattered? Would Amanda have been more supportive of my volunteer work if she'd known I was wealthy enough to fund the entire operation? I think it would have changed how she saw the situation, yes. Miguel, I shouldn't have to prove my financial worth to justify my choice to help other people. The fact that I can afford to support the food bank doesn't make my decision to volunteer there any more valid than it would be if I were just a regular volunteer. But Mom, it shows that you're not some confused elderly woman who's putting herself in danger. It shows that you know exactly what you're doing. I always knew exactly what I was doing, mijo. The question is whether you and Amanda were willing to see that. There was a long pause. Mom, I need to tell you something. Amanda and I have been having some difficult conversations since that night at your apartment. What kind of conversations? Conversations about respect, about autonomy, about the difference between caring for someone and controlling them. Conversations about how my family raised me to value independence and community service, and how those values don't disappear when someone gets older. And how is Amanda handling those conversations? She's struggling, Mom. She's having to confront the possibility that her concerns about you were more about her own discomfort than about your actual well-being. Miguel, I don't want to be the cause of problems in your marriage. Mom, you're not the cause of problems. You're the catalyst that's helping us see problems that were already there. The next few days brought a parade of unexpected visitors and phone calls. The mayor's office called to ask if I'd be interested in serving on a committee about aging services in the city. The local senior center invited me to speak about volunteer opportunities for older adults. The newspaper received letters to the editor from people who'd been inspired by the story to get more involved in community service. But the most surprising call came from David Restrepo, my lawyer. Nancy, I've been getting inquiries about your charitable giving. Apparently, the story about the food bank has generated interest from other nonprofits who are wondering if you might be willing to support their work. David, I don't want to become a public figure. Roberto and I chose anonymous giving for a reason. I understand, but Nancy, your visibility might actually be beneficial. Not just for the organizations that could use your support, but for other elderly people who are facing pressure from families who don't understand their capabilities. What do you mean? I mean that your story demonstrates something important, that age doesn't automatically equal incapacity, that elderly people can be community leaders and significant contributors to society, that independence and service to others can go hand in hand. That afternoon, I received an unexpected visitor. Amanda appeared at my door, looking smaller and less confident than I'd ever seen her. She was carrying a bouquet of flowers and wearing an expression that seemed to be struggling between pride and humility. Nancy, I wondered if we could talk. I invited her in and made coffee, the same ritual we'd performed dozens of times before, but with completely different energy between us. Nancy, I read the newspaper article about the food bank. I had no idea about your donations. Amanda, Roberto and I never publicized our charitable giving. We believed it should be private. But Nancy, you're one of the most significant philanthropists in the city. You've been supporting community organizations for decades. Why didn't you tell us? I set down my coffee cup and looked at her directly. Amanda, would it have changed your opinion of my volunteer work if you'd known I was funding the food bank? She was quiet for a long moment. Yes, it would have. Why? Because I would have understood that you weren't just some elderly woman who didn't know any better. I would have realized that you were there by choice, that you had reasons for your involvement that went beyond just needing something to do. Amanda, I was always there by choice. I always had reasons for my involvement. The only difference is that now you know I have the financial resources to support those choices. I know, and I'm ashamed of how I reacted. I made assumptions about your situation without understanding the full picture. What assumptions? Amanda took a shaky breath. I assumed that elderly people who volunteer at places like food banks do so because they're lonely or confused or don't have better options. I assumed that families needed to protect their elderly relatives from making poor decisions about how to spend their time. I assumed that moving you into a controlled environment would be better for everyone. And now? Now I understand that I was wrong about almost everything. I was wrong about your capabilities, wrong about your judgment, wrong about what would make you happy and fulfilled. I reached across the table and touched her hand. Amanda, what changed your mind? Was it just learning about the donations? Partly. But also talking to Miguel about the values he was raised with, about the importance of community service and independence, and honestly, talking to some of my friends about their own parents and realizing that I was making the same mistakes they'd made, confusing control with care. What mistakes? Assuming that age equals incompetence, assuming that family members always know what's best for elderly relatives, assuming that safety is more important than autonomy. Amanda, I appreciate your honesty, but I need to ask you something. If you hadn't learned about the donations, if you'd continued to see me as just a regular volunteer, would you still be trying to force me into institutional care? She was quiet for a long time, and I could see her wrestling with the uncomfortable truth of her own motivations. Probably yes, and that's what makes me most ashamed. I realize now that I was judging you based on appearances and assumptions rather than taking the time to understand who you really are and what you're really capable of. Amanda, I don't need you to be ashamed. I need you to understand that elderly people deserve respect and autonomy, regardless of their financial status or social connections. The woman who volunteers at the food bank because she needs community and purpose is just as deserving of dignity as the woman who volunteers because she's also funding the operation. I understand that now. And Nancy, I want to apologize for everything, for the pressure, for the facility tours, for the threats about guardianship, for not seeing you clearly. Amanda, apology accepted. But I need you to understand that this isn't just about me. There are thousands of elderly people facing similar pressure from families who think they know better. This is about recognizing that aging doesn't automatically equal incompetence. I understand. And Nancy, I want to do better. I want to learn how to support you without trying to control you. How do you plan to do that? By asking what you need instead of assuming I know what you need. By respecting your choices even when they're not the choices I would make. By remembering that you're the same woman who raised Miguel to be independent and thoughtful, and that those qualities don't disappear when someone gets older. That evening, I sat on my small balcony and reflected on the strange turns my life had taken over the past few months. I'd gone from being pressured to give up my independence to being publicly recognized as a community leader. I'd gone from being seen as a burden to being celebrated as a benefactor. I'd gone from defending my right to make my own choices to inspiring other people to examine their own assumptions about aging and autonomy. But more than any of that, I'd discovered something important about myself. I'd learned that I was stronger than I'd realized, more capable of standing up for myself than I'd ever needed to be before. I'd learned that independence wasn't just about living alone or managing my own affairs. It was about maintaining the right to define my own life according to my own values. The next morning brought one final surprise. Mrs. Chen called to tell me that the recognition ceremony had generated enough interest to secure additional funding for the food bank's operations. Nancy, we've received donations from 6 new sponsors and inquiries from a dozen more. The publicity about your support has helped other people understand how important this work is. Mrs. Chen, that's wonderful, but I hope people understand that the food bank needs ongoing support, not just one-time donations inspired by a news story. Actually, Several of the new donors have expressed interest in following your model, providing both financial support and volunteer time. They want to understand how their money is being used and how they can contribute more than just funding. That's exactly what Roberto and I hoped would happen. We wanted to show that real community support requires both resources and relationships. Nancy, there's something else. The mayor's office has asked if you'd be willing to serve on a task force about aging services in the city. They want to develop policies that support elderly people who want to remain independent and active in their communities. I smiled, thinking about how Amanda would have reacted to this request just a few weeks earlier. Mrs. Chen, I'd be honored to serve on that task force. It sounds like exactly the kind of work that needs to be done. As I hung up the phone, I realized that my story had become bigger than just my own struggle for independence. It had become a demonstration that elderly people could be community leaders, significant contributors, and autonomous decision-makers. It had challenged assumptions about aging, about charity, about the relationship between financial resources and social value. Most importantly, it had shown that the fight for independence wasn't just about the right to live alone or make your own choices. It was about the right to remain fully human as you age, to continue growing and contributing and making a difference in the world around you. 6 months later, as I prepared for the annual Riverside Community Food Bank fundraising dinner, reflected on how much had changed. The event was being held at the convention center downtown, with over 300 people expected to attend. I would be giving the keynote address, sharing the story of how Roberto and I had chosen to support the food bank and why we'd believed that true community service required both generosity and presence. Miguel and Amanda would be there, along with Lauren and her family who were flying in from Portland. Mrs. Chen would be honored as Volunteer of the Year, and several families who'd been helped by the food bank would share their stories. The evening would raise money for expansion of services, but more importantly, it would demonstrate that addressing hunger and poverty required the whole community working together. As I put on the navy blue dress I'd worn to so many important occasions over the years, I thought about the woman who'd stood in the food bank line just months earlier, feeling ashamed and abandoned and invisible. That woman had discovered she was none of those things. She was valuable, respected, and essential to the community she'd served quietly for 15 years. But the real victory wasn't in the public recognition or the community honors. The real victory was in the knowledge that I'd fought for my right to define my own life and won. I'd refused to let fear or pressure or other people's assumptions determine how I would spend my remaining years. I'd insisted on remaining active, engaged, and useful. And I'd proven that those choices were not only valid, but vital. As I prepared to leave for the dinner, I looked around the apartment that had been my home for nearly 5 decades. Tomorrow, I would continue living here, continue volunteering at the food bank, continue supporting the community that had given me so much meaning and purpose. I would continue being Nancy Martinez, not just the woman who'd survived the attempt to control her life, but the woman who'd thrived in spite of it. The recognition had been unexpected, but the independence had been earned. And in a world that too often tried to diminish elderly people, that made all the difference. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.